All of these tribes were originally black tribes of the Yamasee. And as far as the Yamasee mixing with the African slaves, the Yamasee and African runaways had a few things in common. They were both of the same ethnic background, they were able to blend in with each other, and they both had hatred for the British. Throughout slavery, thousands of African slaves escaped the plantations and sought refuge with the neighboring Native American tribes. The natives had an incredible knowledge of outdoor survival and location. It is often believed that Harriet Tubman herself, who freed slaves via the underground.
What you're seeing right here is $60,000. Did you know the average profit on a flip is
Railroad was herself a black Native American because of her knowledge of the paths and the terrain. Many African slaves and Native Americans mixed. Even the red tribes took in African slaves. Some tribes even owned slaves. However, unlike the European, Africans were mostly considered indentured servants and treated as human beings by their Native American owners. Today there are red Seminoles and black Seminoles, red Creeks and black Creeks, red Cherokee and black Cherokee. The Seminoles, they did oppose slavery. The U.S. Army prosecuted the Seminoles because they opposed slavery. The Seminoles realized that the people who were being sold into slavery were a faction of them, distant cousins, relatives in a way. The black Seminoles was the only tribe at the time that opposed slavery. U.S. slaveholders tried to cause tension between red Seminoles and black Seminoles. Thus, a war erupted between the Seminoles and the U.S. slaveholders. Seminoles and African slaves joined together and attacked slave plantations. General Andrew Jackson prepared to wipe out the Seminoles. Jackson gathered Creek tribes along the U.S. soldiers to destroy the Seminoles. This war lasted for decades and extended all throughout Florida. By 1826, wealthy Creeks who had also owned slaves were sent to persuade the Seminoles to join in on the slave trade. When the Seminoles once again refused, Seminoles were kidnapped and sold on the southern slave markets. The U.S. Army was also trying to push the red Seminoles out of Florida onto reserved Indian territory west of the Mississippi. The Army was faced with much opposition with the resistance of the Seminoles, who were guided by the red Seminole chief Osakala. The red Seminoles knew that the whites would not follow after them for their fear of alligators and snakes. The black Seminoles remained in Texas and moved into Oklahoma, Idaho, and mixed in with the Blackfeet, Comanche, the Kiowa, Apache, the Mandan, the Omaha, Osage, Pawnee, and Arikara, and their closest relatives, the Wichita. You know, people wonder if the actual Blackfoot Indians got their name because they were black Americans. And, you know, that's not necessarily so. The Blackfoot Indians got their name because they would stain their moccasins with burnt ashes. The Blackfoot tribe was at one time Saskatchewan Native Americans who relocated to the Montana in search for buffalo. The Blackfoot or Blackfeet consists of three divisions: the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piegan. The entire group is known as Bloods and are descendants of the Wichita Yamasee Moors. If you look closely at many Native American tribes, you can still see their African traits. You may wonder, are there any black tribes left? There is a woman named Verdiachi Washita Turner Gaston L. Bay, and she is the legal heir by blood to the Mason Rouge land grants that were willed to her by her great-great-grandfather Henry Turner. Verdiachi's land is the District of Louisiana, which is named after her great-great-great-grandfather's friend, Louis Bourguignon, who sold the land to Joseph de Maison Rouge in 1795. Joseph had a daughter named Anne, in which the land went to her. Annie named the land Louisiana after Louis and Annie. In 1848, the U.S. government took the Turners to court to take the District of Louisiana. However, the government lost, and the land was granted to the heirs of Henry Turner, Verdiachi Washita Turner Gaston L. Bay. Baridachi has set up a sovereign nation of Washita Moors that is recognized by the United States government. The Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minority Workers Groups on Indigenous Populations recognized the Wichita as the oldest indigenous people on the earth. The U.S. government does not own the District of Louisiana, as we may believe. Also, the state of Georgia is owned by a Yamasee. It is documented. Many Native Americans signed treaties with the U.S. government but never actually sold any of their land over. Technically, the land still belongs to the so-called Indians, not the federal government. So you may be wondering if I'm trying to say that out of the 550 some odd Native American tribes, they're all descendants of black people. I'm saying that all so-called American Indians descended from the Mexican Olmecs and the various African and Asian mixtures throughout. How does this make other Native Americans feel, especially today's Red Indian? It is important that we as Americans understand the origin of the so-called American Indian, and it is important that we accept the truth. Black Indians are no more native than the so-called red man in culture. The culture and religion that is practiced by today's Native Americans is the natural, non-theological concept of the Malian Moors of Africa, the Olmecs, and the Aztecs of Mexico, as well as the early concept of the mound builders. There are various tribes today that will admit to their African ancestry. The Hopis, Apache, Aztec, Zuni, Nez Perce, Miami, Blackfoot, Catawba, and Seminole all possess knowledge of African ancestry. What's more important is not the feeling concerning indigenous people, but more so the truthful data and the validity and acceptance of that data. You may be asking, why do Red Native Americans believe that they are the first? Well, many Red Native Americans are well aware of the information that I've just presented to you, and some are not aware. Tribes like the Hopi, Aztec, Apache, Pueblo, Seminole, Creek, Tuscaros, and Susquehanna have documents in their possession that tells the stories of the black gods who gave them birth. In fact, the Hopi Book of the Stars that was given to them by the Dogons tells that when the forefathers, Africans, reclaim their throne, the black and red tribes will join together and overcome their oppressors. There is a similar parable in most Native American cultures that speaks of the white eagle who has captured the red eagle until the black eagle freed the red eagle. The white eagle retreated into the caves from which he came. Look up this story. It's an actual Native American culture. It is just as important for Native Americans to understand true history as it is for black Americans to understand true history. Blacks have been convinced that they are all ex-African slaves. Of course, this is a lie. There had been blacks in this country for thousands of years before the first Europeans. There are millions of blacks in America today who, if they trace their family heritage back, will not find any African slavery in their family. Many blacks are children of the Yamasee, Seminole, Creek, Cherokee, Blackfoot, Shoshone, etc. However, the U.S. government, in order to protect their best interests, has kept most of this information and true history from us. The U.S. government has convinced us to classify ourselves as a title that the European political system created in order to place us in a certain social bracket, African American. As an African American, we have no inalienable or indigenous rights under the Constitution. Even worse, as an African American Christian, we dig an even deeper hole for ourselves. As black Christians, we have to admit two things. We are former slaves by calling ourselves African, and we are former slaves who converted to the slave owner's religion. Thus, we sever any connection to sovereignty or self-identity. As African American Christians, we literally become dependent on the government and relinquish all indigenous and self-governing classifications. Thus, we throw ourselves on the mercy of the U.S. judicial system. Native Americans have what is called autonomy or self-government, similar to diplomatic immunity. As indigenous people, we have the right to set up our own sovereign nations. We govern our own judicial, legislative, and penal system. As African Americans, we waived the right of self-governing and indigenous rights by admitting that we are immigrants, came over from somewhere else, and not indigenous. The African slave trade. Much of the so-called African slave trade was fabricated and widely exaggerated. There was no trade. An independent source showing that the so-called Indians on the eastern seaboard, also called Terra Nova or Moors, is called the book African and Native Americans by Jack D. Forbes. He shows in the book how many so-called Native American Indians were sold into slavery in Africa and Europe. This is the opposite direction in which we were taught the slave trade went. These Native Americans or Indians were classified as Negroes and blacks in the slave books of Seville, Spain, and elsewhere. On page 29 he says, and I quote, "Slaves from Terra Nova show up in the slave markets of Seville and Valencia very soon after 1500. For example, in Valencia during the period to 1516, we find in 1503 Miguel Man, in 1505 Juan and Pedro, and in 1507 Antonio and Juan Amarco. In 1515 Ali, now Melchor, and in 1516 Catalina. They were all classified as Negroes." Unquote. Now, think about this. If we were first brought to North America around 1619, or even as early as 1555 for that matter, then how were they taking slaves from Newfoundland to Europe, all before 1520? Keep in mind that one of the Native Americans even had the name Ali, and all were classified as Negroes once they reached Valencia. How did a Native American in 1515 have a Moorish name, Ali? At least 3,000 Americans, so-called Indians, are known to have been shipped to Europe between 1493 and 1501, the Columbus expeditions, with the likely total possibly double that. Most were sent to the Seville area, where they seem to show up in the slave markets as Negroes. These are major contradictions to the whole slave trade myth. Blacks were always in America. The missing Indians are Negroes. The slaves sold on the slave markets in the South were initially the black people from right here in this hemisphere. As they took the lands here, they enslaved the inhabitants of those lands who were black. The tens of millions of Americans, so-called Indians, who disappeared after 1492 did not all die in the Holocaust inflicted within America. Many thousand were sent to Europe and Africa as slaves. The whole slave trade myth is that the whole story was given to us in reverse. A mass colony of Africans were not shipped from Africa to America, but the truth is that black Indians were shipped from America to Europe. They were then shipped from Spain to Africa as a commodity for African resources. These black Indians, now mistaken as Africans, were shipped back to America and classified as African slaves. This part of our history is what the school systems failed to mention in their history programs. Am I saying that there was no slave trade? There was indeed a kidnapping of Africans from Africa to America. However, it was the result of the mass shipment and slaughter of the Moors in America at the hands of the Columbus expeditions. Columbus's first journey in 1492 was a mission to capture gold, but he was sidetracked by the presence of the black Moors. Columbus sent the word back to the monarchs of Spain that they were what he referred to in his logs as the people of the Queen of Sheba. Columbus kidnapped Arawak Indians along with gold nuggets, exotic birds, and grain. Queen Isabella provided Columbus with 17 ships, 1,500 men, cannons, crossbows, guns, and attack dogs for the second voyage. Columbus's new mission was to conquer the West. When Columbus returned to the West, Haiti, and South America in 1493, he not only took raw materials and resources, but he abducted women. After a short time, the Arawaks resisted Columbus, and on March 25th, 1495, Columbus slaughtered thousands of Arawak native men, women, and babies. Columbus also rounded up 1,500 Arawaks and shipped them to Spain. Columbus became the first man known in history to send the first slaves across the Atlantic. Other nations rushed to emulate Columbus. In 1501, the Portuguese began to depopulate the Bituque Indians to Cape Verde as slaves. The black Indian slavery destroyed the Indian nations of Natchez, the Yamasee, and the Pequots. Because of this, the first African slave raid took place in 1505 and was spearheaded by Columbus's son. When the Moors, the Indians, of America began dying and committing suicide, the labor was replaced with slaves from the Sahara in West Africa. Also, the gold and silver that Columbus extracted from America fueled a 400% inflation that eroded the economies of the non-European nations and helped Europe to develop a global market system. Africa suffered a great economical blow. The trans-Saharan trade collapsed because America supplied more precious gems than the African West Coast. African traders now only had one commodity that Europe wanted: slaves. African sultans thus sold their own black people into slavery to whites. It is safe to say that Columbus is solely responsible for slavery of the Moors, from west to east and from east to west. This is the bottom of an African slave ship. These were called big bottoms, as they were constructed to hold hundreds of Africans packed like sardines. These trips from Africa to America took up to 3 to 4 months from east to west. According to history, these hundreds of Africans urinated and defecated on themselves during the journey. Now come on, 4 months of constant urination and defecation? These slaves would have literally drowned. Does this story really make sense? The Dogons were already on American land because they simply sailed over by way of the worldwide wind and currents. The Dogons were already on American land because they simply sailed over by way of the worldwide wind and currents. The first Africans to set foot on American soil were in fact the Dogons of Mali, who used such currents as the Canary and the North Equilateral Current that recycled from West Africa to America and into the upper Atlantic Ocean. This was before the invention of sails. The Guinea Current flows eastward along the Guinea coast, with frequent cycles out to the sea, where it joins the South Equatorial. The second group of Africans to land in America were under the leadership of Abu Bakari in 1311 and had mixed in with the Olmecs and became known as the Washoe. The third group of Africans to land on American soil were the Idrisids, who were the ruling dynasty of southern Morocco and Mauritania, who came into Morocco before the invasion by the Dogon Malians and the Senegalese. This group of Moors arrived in 1727 with Mensa Khan Musa, who was searching for his ancestors of Abu Bakari. And indeed, the Washoes were Moors. Let's go back a little bit more and explore this topic about the Moors. I previously stated that the Olmecs were of Mali, and that does make them Moors. Absolutely, the Olmecs were indeed Malian Moors. The Mayans were the descendants of the Malian Moors and were often referred to as Black Mexicans or Quetzalcoatl. There are ancient Mexican wall paintings that depict these Negroid kings as rulers and are unmistakably African. These Moors were the people who built the Great Pyramids all over South America, Peru, Canada, Alaska, and Georgia. Scattered all throughout North America along the Mississippi River and its tributaries are found mounds built out of tons of earth, tons and tons of earth. The people who built them were called the mound builders, and they were the descendants of the Malian Moors, the Olmecs. These Moors eventually migrated to North America from Mexico and became known as the Washita, the Yamasee, and the Ben Ismael tribe. The Ben Ismael tribe was a collection of what is known as the Lenape, the Wampanoag, and the Nanticoke Indians, who migrated to Indiana and Illinois and referred to themselves as Moors, even though the United States government continued to classify them as Negroes in order to strip them of their indigenous rights. It is often not talked about, but the Moors had enslaved the Europeans before they enslaved blacks. Their women were sold like commodities into the harems and as concubines of wealthy Moors. This is the reason why the Moorish noble were for the most part bleached out and became as tawny Moors, Turks and Arabs, which are no more than fixed mulatto races. This is also the reason for the Moors in the coats of arms of the noble European families, this so-called black nobility of Europe. The European nations paid tribute to the Moors well into the 18th century. In the book, The United States and Barbary Powers, the English, French, Dutch, Danes, and Swedes, and may I say all nations, are tributary to them. David McRitchie in the book Ancient and Modern Britons says the word blackmail is the result of this tribute paid to the black army or black oppressors as the English referred to them. The Moors had control of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. This is why the Marines sing of defeating the Moors, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, confirming the extent of the Moorish empire and dominions of Amexem or Atlantis. Here you see the first page of the Moroccan Treaty of 1787. It should also be noted that Shakespeare's most famous Moor, Othello, is also described as a black African. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin worked closely with Moors in the Continental Congress to secure this treaty. In the Bevins collection, there are over 200 letters to the Bey of Morocco from the Continental Congress. There were many Moors in the Continental Congress working with the European Masons originally taught by the Moors to form Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new secular order of the ages, e pluribus unum, out of many peoples, nations, one. The Moroccan Treaty is very powerful because, according to the Constitution, treaties are the law of the land. This treaty specifically deals with Moors. The question that may arise, how do we know that, where the treaty says Moors, the so-called black people of the time is being referred to? The Moors were considered citizens or part of the we the people who ratified the Constitution. It says, quote, thus an act was passed in Massachusetts on the 6th of March, 1788, forbidding any Negro not a subject of the Empire of Morocco or a citizen of the United States from carrying in the Commonwealth, unquote. For this would show that those who referred to as Negroes were actually Moors, and that they were on the same footing or status as citizens. Those who remembered that they were Moors used the Moroccan Treaty of 1787 to secure the rights on the same footing as the state's citizens without otherwise being obligated members of their social equality. While those who were brainwashed into believing they were Negroes, descendants of Africans brought here by Europeans, were unprotected by the Moroccan Treaty, as well as the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. This document says, and I quote, a petition was presented to the House from free sundry Moors, subjects of the Emperor of Morocco, and residents in the state, praying that in case they should commit any fault amendable to be brought to justice, that they as subjects to a prince here in North America, in alliance with the United States of America, via the Moroccan Treaty of 1787, may be tried under the same laws as the citizens of the state would be liable to be tried, and not under the Negro Act, which was received and read. End quote. Thus, you have Moors back in 1789 saying what we say now. Our nationality is Moorish, not Negro, black, colored, etc.